Welcome to this journey where we dialogue with thought and heart leaders to share their reflections on human condition and how to improve them.
Today we have with us Matthew Tice. Matt is the Chief Executive Officer of Insurgence, a firm dedicated to helping organizations to navigate through disruptive change. Matt started his career as a nuclear engineer with the United States Navy. In his previous role, Matt was Managing Director and Founding Partner for the Asia Pacific at the Palladium Group. He has worked with many of the world's leading thinkers like Dr. Norton, Dr. Kaplan, and Jim Collins.
So welcome, Matt. Welcome to this journey and extraordinary times we are in. And so tell me something about your life out there right now. What's happening out there in the place that you are in?
Okay, well, first, I'm in Sydney, Australia at the moment, and we're experiencing a progressive shutdown, I would describe it. So there were what they described stage one shutdown of cafes, bars, gyms, and other social kind of venues over the last week, and then progressively that's getting more and more tight as the virus progresses. So right now we're in what I would describe as a middle state between total shutdown and not so much shutdown, but it's surreal, really, when you're out and about, and even then you have to avoid being out and about. But even just walking the dog, you might run into somebody that you know, and everyone has their story, and they're very interesting to hear them. Most people are working from home. Most kids are homeschooling. Most people in the middle income bracket and below are very concerned about maintaining their employment. So it's an interesting period of time.
Interesting. And you're quite an outdoor person as well, I guess. I've been watching some of your Facebook posts. You've been a sports person in the sense you've been playing sports for quite some time. And so how are you coping with that particular thing? Because your outdoor activities are going to be far and few, or maybe none as such.
Well, I guess for my own part, we had a rugby tour in Denver scheduled for June, which was canceled, which was gutted me, because that was something to really look forward to. But ironically, since I have a little bit more free time on my hands, I've been getting up in the morning and really doubling down on the exercise, running very diligently and hitting the weights and everything else. So we also have a farm property where we sort of split our time between our home in Sydney and our rural property, where there's plenty of exercise to be had out there, chopping wood and moving bales of hay around and all kinds of stuff. So it's I'm managing, let's put it that way.
Interesting. And Matt, the next very important question, which I'm asking most of my guests in this series of COVID-19 and beyond, is how are you thinking through this? In the sense, over the years, you've built your own abilities to look at phenomenon and then trying to categorize them or trying to pin them down in terms of correlations and causalities, or putting some theories around it. So how are you thinking through this? Like, what are you doing on a day-to-day basis or on a periodic basis to make sense of this, whatever is happening?
Well, I think there's three levels to my answer to that question. I think there's a level of that question for my family. There's a level of that question for my businesses, and then there's a level of that question for my clients, which, I guess, with family, it's all about trying to maintain a cadence, if you will, of family life, which is, the kids are at school and meal times are at the right appropriate time, and keeping everyone calm and not drifting or getting, letting the anxiety sort of overwhelm anyone. And I think that's probably good advice for business as well. So I guess in general at home, we're trying to keep things kind of as normal as possible while these sort of constraints get layered onto our lives. In my business, it's interesting because of what we do, and my business is really focused on helping organizations to proactively deal with disruption. So this is a major disruption for most businesses, and for my business, we've architected the business to be very, very disruption proof. So from a point of view of everything's a variable cost in my business. We don't have a lot of overhead, even though we might have, anywhere between 20 and 50 consultants working on projects. They're typically professionals that have portfolio careers working in other areas as well. So we're very robust from that point of view. That said, we've had clients that have had challenges that are very precipitous declines, for example, over the last few weeks. Which makes it difficult for them to continue the work. So I feel like we've done a good job in my business to maintain a kind of robust disruption-proof business model, which is now, and we probably have 2 years of runway. If it all goes to the worst possible case, then the only problems that we're going to have are going to be very much first world problems. And I think, and it won't go that way because there's already a tremendous amount of demand for companies trying to deal with this, and we're working with our clients on these issues. So, including numerous healthcare organizations as well. So we've been really in the background on this whole thing. And the thing with my clients, though, I think the interesting thing, and this is something we should explore a bit. I think that to your original question, what am I interested in this sort of era? And over the last sort of 18 to 24 months, we've been very focused on very much two key questions. And the first question is really, how stable is the environment around your business? And the reason I think that's an important question is because even on the long wave, most organizations, I think we surveyed, it was about 2017 or so, we surveyed almost 400 CEOs globally to kind of get an answer to that question. A little bit over 80% said that the environment is unstable and likely to be more unstable in the future. And what we mean by unstable is that, the change is no longer predictable. So now here we are in a situation of, almost total instability for everybody, even though, depending on what you read and what your own scenario analysis sort of precipitates out, you'll find that there's a relatively predictable course for this, but it's only one of many things happening. There's COVID, there's technology change, there's going to be emerging competitive threats, which we're not able to see at this time, and all these things will mash up and create a tremendous amount of instability for organizations. Even in terms of organizational models and how leadership works inside organizations. Importantly, how those organizations navigate the future will be different. So that first question of how stable is your environment is an important one. And then the follow-up question to that is, and the one that we spend almost all of our time working through, is how robust is your business model to that change? And what we found is, in studying dozens and dozens of companies around the world, is that most organizations build their business models around a very strong assumption of stability and on a foundation of assumptions that things won't change very much. And therefore, when things do change a lot and that change challenges core assumptions, very quickly that model can be undermined, and it's very difficult to recover from that unless you're super proactive and you're aware of what those assumptions are and under what conditions they won't be true anymore. And even in that, there's some basic idea that most organizations even understand what their business model is. And then the fact is that they don't. Most business leaders have inherited a business model from other people. So therefore, it's an interesting it's an interesting time to challenge this. And if you look across industries, the obvious ones, health, education, where all of a sudden we see certain things that have been sort of bubbling along below the surface. Let's take it in Australia in particular with telehealth and telemedicine, which has now overnight become mainstream, and the government is now, racing at a pace of knots to kind of catch up with that. Similarly, in education, we've had this idea of distance learning and new models evolving around Khan Institute and other things, which have been on the periphery for a long time, and now all of a sudden they're thrust into the mainstream. I think that institutions are going to come out the backside of this looking very different, and those that aren't really equipped to make those changes are going to be in trouble. They're going to be what I describe as prey, not predators. And so the advice that we kind of give our clients right now is that there's really no better time. Yeah, on one hand, you've got to get your cash under control, and you've got to make sure that you're solvent and that you're a going concern in 3 months' time. But there's no better time to step back and fundamentally review how your model will change in the future and how that will create opportunities for the firm going forward. And that includes everything from how you manage people to how you compete in the marketplace to how you innovate and so forth.
Very interesting, Matt. In fact, as you were speaking, I was reminded of a conversation that I heard between Clayton Christensen and the Harvard professor who came up with this whole terminology around disruptive innovation. And there was this conversation they were having at Singularity University, and they were talking about the incumbents and the insurgent, as your organization is championing. And the whole idea was that when organizations scale up and they become bigger, they become bureaucratic, and that sort of does not gel well with the whole idea of disruptive innovation. And a lot of organizations then for most organizations the path to innovation is either make or buy. So the make becomes very difficult because the existing structure doesn't allow for it. So that's one piece that I heard you say, that you're talking to organizations to think in this way. And there's another piece where how does one even plan for something like this, in the sense what is happening right now? And if I follow a little on this, then most of the thinkers are currently saying that this is a black swan kind of an event. Would you agree with that, or how do you see this? Like, can you even plan for something like this?
Right. I mean, there's a few questions tied up in that, I suppose. I'll answer your most recent question first, and then we'll work our way back up into the Clay Christensen part of the question. Look, I think the question of whether this is a black swan or not is kind of a red herring. This type of thing is inevitable. There were signals over the last 20 years with SARS and Ebola and other things happening that this could happen. It could be global. So organizations that haven't factored in at least the major economic impact of some event, whether it be GFC 2.0, which obviously we're kind of on the precipice of, or a specific pandemic type situation like this, or even localized situations like the Fukushima situation in Japan. These signals are out there if people are listening. So I hesitate to say it's a black swan. I think that organizations tend to be very short-term in their optimization of results and try to get the most out of their current context with their current model and their current economic engine. And therefore, when that gets upset, they're very unprepared. And to your point, I guess to wind back to the Christensen point, is that as organizations grow and mature, they become more inflexible or less flexible, depending on how you want to look at that. And as a result, they're not programmed to innovate on. We describe it as the x-axis innovation, which is basically the innovation that happens that are really around your core model, as opposed to product innovation or service innovation or even process innovation, which is probably what most organizations are trying to focus on right now, is how can I get as much cost out of the business as fast as possible. But that's not necessarily going to tide them over as we come out of this situation. I've just written a book on this topic called Insurgence, which is all about kind of drawing the contrast between the incumbent and the insurgent and trying to discover, if you will, the key recipe or the secret sauce of the insurgent, and to see what can be applied in the world of the incumbent. And I think one of the things that we've kind of discovered is that all of these things are choices. So almost every variable except for the uncertainty in the environment surrounding the business is a choice that can be made. If you want to have a more variable structure and therefore be less subject, if you will, to the marginal economics of your industry or your firm, then that's a choice you can make. But the trade-off on that might be short-term sales or EBIT or whatever. And always finding that balance of resilience and short-term profitability is a difficult one. And the way our systems are set up is the easy choice is always the short-term profitability.
Yeah. And Matt, you spent so much of your time and career spanning so many diverse industries and geographies, and you must have championed similar kind of mindset or a version of it in the earlier avatar before your entrepreneurship journey. What kind of responses would you get when you champion these kind of, or when you even posit it to people and want to draw their attention towards something like this?
It's a very good question. I think that there's always, I could break it down into three responses, okay? One response, which is an organization that we might find with a CEO that's in trouble, right? For whatever reason. They're looking over the horizon and the model is no longer robust to the change, and they can extrapolate their economics out to a point in time and see when they go out of business, right? So our message is very relevant and resonant to that particular individual because, there has to be action right now. The second archetype, if you will, for leaders are what I would describe as enlightened leaders, ones that are always looking for the next opportunity to either improve the organization or leave behind, for example, a legacy where that business emerges stronger than where they picked it up. And that, again, our message is extremely resonant to those types of leaders who understand deeply that the business model that they inherited can't be the one that they left behind. Famously, Jim Collins was asked a question about Jack Welch, who recently passed away. And it was interesting, his comment on how do you think Jack Welch has done over his tenure? His comment was that something to the effect of, I reserve judgment to see how his successor performs, based on the idea that your performance as a leader is not a function of your start and end date, but a function of the legacy that you leave behind. And I found that to be a very powerful comment. Then the third are the ostriches in the sand, the arrogant leader archetype, where they have it in hand. They're, for whatever reason, under certain pressures to deliver in the short term, and are not thinking about the bigger questions, not really thinking about how the convergence of different trends will impact their business in the future, not thinking about what the assumptions are underpinning their model and how those might change, not even thinking, and this is a point that we raise in the book, many organizations don't even develop strategy, they just develop plans which describe they want more stuff, more revenue, more EBIT, more customers, more market share, and they do things to try to get those outcomes without contextualizing what's happening around them. So therefore their planning is inherently flawed or designed for an incredibly stable sort of context, which, as I've pointed out already, that's no longer the case for almost anyone.
Interesting. The survival-oriented, panic-stricken archetype, the enlightened archetype, and maybe the grandiose or I know it all archetype, perhaps. Yeah. So I'm sure you encountered so many of them in your journey. And are there any strategies that are effective to even shift them, or it's just impossible to shift them?
Look, everyone's on their own journey, and it's very interesting. I think there's almost two axes to consider, right? One is what I would describe as the life journey of a leader himself or herself. Okay, so you'll find that certain leaders are, and probably the pivot point for this is what I describe as post-ego and pre-ego, okay? And post-ego are leaders that have graduated in their own minds beyond their own self-importance and see the benefit of bringing others along and start thinking about their legacy and see the opportunities that are in front of them by working with others to accomplish things, are able to mobilize resources in a way that the pre-ego leaders are not. So, and the pre-ego leaders are, and all of us at various points in our career, either as young people or in new roles or whatever, can be in a pre-ego stage where their own self-importance will trump, if you will, the success of the organization, or asking the right questions, or, we can kind of, I don't want to draw any, you can see this playing out in the political landscape kind of in real time.
I heard the word.
No, that was a different context, but you can see how, people are in different points. So that's one axis. The other axis is what I would describe as the tribal axis. Okay. And it's very interesting to think about both individuals and tribes in terms of how their behavior unfolds, especially during a crisis. I'm actually working on another book right now, which kind of covers this issue of kind of mass, or what we describe as hyper-mobilization. And hyper-mobilization being, how can you mobilize resources at an incredibly fast pace? It's relatively straightforward to do that in a crisis, as we're seeing in real time. Hospitals popping up in China, pop-up inspection stations. I mean, just we saw in the bushfires in Australia over the last 6 months, where people were mobilizing resources in ways that you could never imagine, where, somebody needs something in some rural town and somebody in a beach community would find out about that and get them resources within, in some cases, hours. Unreal kind of mobilization. You see that similarly if you're working in an oil company and an oil head bursts. You'll see how quickly people work across functions to achieve the outcome of capping the well. But we're not programmed as individuals or in tribes to be able to react and respond in a way that mobilizes lots of resources to things that are important unless there's a crisis. And I believe that's hardwired into our limbic brains, where, the fight or flight sort of response to that applies with organizations too. We're very good when it's an immediate crisis, and we're not very good otherwise. And I reflect on having worked with probably 5 or 6 different militaries from around the world over the last 25 years. They're unreal in their ability to adapt to military threats and crises, but in the bureaucratic world, they're almost completely dysfunctional. We used to talk about the notion of the shovel in the bucket, and people would always say, "Matt, what are you talking about with the shovel in the bucket?" And I would always say, in some of these organizations, everyone's carrying around both a bucket and a shovel, and the shovel is to dig the ground out from underneath the person next to you, and the bucket has sand in it, and it's to try to fill in the ground underneath your own feet as people are digging it out. And that sort of treadmill of filling and digging is what you observe in bureaucratic hierarchies, which is very unproductive. But you tend to see that fall away when there's a common goal or a common enemy or a common crisis that everyone has to work towards. The big question I think that raises for me is, can we learn how to operate that way all the time? And can we create new organizational models and structures that will allow us to articulate how business is conducted in a very different way? And that's the thing I'm interested in right now.
So much. I think there's so much that you covered in that, Matt, and so dense and very rich. Let me just go over some of them. You mentioned about this twin axis in terms of the ego, the post-ego and the pre-ego, and the tribal part of it, the ability to hyper-mobilize is what you're saying. And you also interestingly pointed out that when there is a common enemy or a common purpose, or rather more common enemy, and you definitely see a lot of activities across, or a lot of examples in the world where things just get mobilized. Your example of the army is also very interesting, or rather defense is very interesting, where on one side they're so responsive, so adaptive, and then you look at the back end or the bureaucracy of it, it's the complete opposite. There is one question that is popping up in times of crisis. Okay, let me just step back. Certain decisions need to be made at a very, very fast pace in times of crisis. And do you see collective decision making as still efficient, or do you see a decisive leader just taking that call, working out, or are these again even contextual in terms of the thing?
I was going to say they're all contextual, right? Because some decisions can be made decisively. Other decisions need to be made, which will not be successfully executed without buy-in and collaboration. And that applies during crisis, not during crisis. But I would say all things equal, the pendulum swings towards more autocratic decision-making in a crisis. And therefore, the ability to mobilize becomes, somewhat more at a higher pace than during times of relative stability. But I think that question of how to make decisions and, how to, if you will, how to engage people to make those decisions in a way that takes into account the data that's available to you and converts that into clarity in terms of what question we're trying to answer or what decision we're trying to make, and then making sure that there's a fabric inside the leadership that allows for that type of conversation to happen. Typically, the cycles are very slow they're very slow in times of relative stability. So a lot of decisions may kind of unfold over a quarter or even a half year that could be made in minutes, right? In fact, in my book, I articulated an example of my early Navy career, where we were trying to make an engineering decision and it didn't happen. And I was young and working with this leadership team, and probably had no right to be on this leadership team. But every month we'd have this meeting, and I can't talk about the specific problem we were trying to solve but it would come up and it would be on the agenda. We work on it a little bit, delegate, and then people would come back and, it wouldn't be solved. And finally, I remember we're looking out the window of the boardroom, and across the river, these people they built an entire baseball stadium in the time that we were deliberating on this decision, from breaking ground to having the fans in the stadium. It took them about 6 months.
Wow.
And this is how long it took us to make the decision. And finally, I got very irritated and fed up with it, and forced all these people to kind of come to the table and make the decision. And it turned out we could work out what the problem was relatively quickly. We got people involved, the right people involved that were not the leaders, but the people that dealt with the problem, to come in and so forth, and finally solve the problem very quickly. But we didn't have a mechanism in our governance to allow that. You know what I mean? There was sort of an assumption of slow mobility.
Interesting. A question pops up here, Matt, and I'm assuming that the answer is going to be both, but still, let me see how you weigh in on this. So the question is, can we attribute this slow decision making to a skill deficit model or a personality clash model, or could we attribute it to the structures, the in-between spaces that we have, and the incentives and the rules and the norms that govern that? What do you think is the function there?
It's a very good question. You're right. I am going to answer both. Okay. So I think, just imagine a scenario where you're a leader in a business, and you've been in that business for 25 years, and that business has been very successful, and nothing's really come to upset the apple cart. So therefore, things have been sailing along, and that's been your career, and your experience is sort of, if you will, grounded in that kind of context. And then all of a sudden, something comes up where you've got to decide very quickly you could just imagine that most people would be a victim, if you will, of their experience, and their relative field of view being, gosh, things don't change very much. How do I deal with this? Is it their fault? Well, maybe, but I would suggest it's not a skills deficiency, at least deliberately. It's just a field of view deficiency. So they've never been given the need to build up that muscle. Okay. Whereas if you're a Navy pilot, for example, and you've got to make split second decisions almost every day for a big part of your career and find yourself in business, and then here you are in a situation where things move very slow, which will be quite frustrating, your muscle memory will default back to rapid decision making. Those are kind of two extremes. And I think most of us find ourselves in the middle of that, where occasionally a crisis comes up and we've got to dust off the books, as it were, to figure out how to deal with that. And then finally, okay, we kind of get it and we go forward. I wouldn't suggest that most leaders deliberately ignore those skills, but certainly there are different personality types, and some are much more attuned to rapid decision making. And it's sort of it's a complex question. I think every individual deals with it themselves. I've met people who are fantastic at dealing with corporate emergencies, and others that can't. Those same people can't deal with a crisis at home. You know what I mean? So again, context is super important. But I think anyone who's not really who's not reading, who's not thinking about these things is probably doing themselves, their business, their people, even their families a disservice, because just the marginal change that can torpedo the performance, success, or even survivability of a business can be so finite and so small. Like if you take Corona right now in retail, you watch what's happening in retail, where there's a whole bunch of companies we have on our watch list. And these companies have already been subject to a major shift with, kind of the online retail business models, and they've not been able to adapt quickly enough. And, the Sears, the Myers, and the big traditional retailers, these companies are going to be gone in the next 6, 12, 18 months. Companies that have been around for hundreds of years. It's just that the smash up of these trends, COVID plus change in consumer behavior plus availability of online business models, these things are now going to collide and accelerate this change so quickly that the marginal change of, okay, we lose 3% market share this year, we can adjust to that. 3 more next year, we can adjust to that. Now it's 20%, 30% overnight. The marginal economics of these firms are just not going to recover from those.
Yeah. What I hear you say is COVID-19 perhaps is going to be a compulsory reset button for them.
If it's not, then, look, it is a compulsory reset button for them. It's a compulsory reset button for everyone. It really is. I mean, who would have, you talk about the black swan. What would happen if all of your operations ceased overnight? That's not a traditional scenario question. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The traditional scenario question is something very benign, like what if your competitor came in with a new product that was way better than yours? We do a lot in my firm. We have a game theory practice, which is all about exploring these kinds of really bizarre, complex disruptions and how they mash together with other things, and how in a pressure cooker situation you got to make these kinds of decisions. And it's very powerful to be able to step back and, if you will, war game these types of constructs. And we do it a lot, for example, for the introduction of new medicines. So what would happen if a batch is completely corrupted and everyone dies from that particular batch? How would you respond to that? But not only how would you respond, but it's in a pressure cooker situation where the entire ecosystem is acting in concert around every decision that they make. And that kind of analysis is extremely powerful for these types of situations.
So, in fact, just harking back to the point that you were making just before that, in terms of you gave an interesting example of a leader having his team and the company is just sailing along. There are no too many crises to face, and then suddenly they encounter a crisis, and because they've not exercised the muscle over a period of time, even the smallest of the crises might be the biggest of the crisis for them in that sense, perhaps.
Yeah.
Actually, what you said echoes very well with this psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer, who talks a lot about heuristics as a very important part of our decision making. And in fact, the nuance of that is that over a period of time, as you keep working your way through different risks and crises, you build a gut, you build an intuition, which becomes your intelligence system to respond. Which, if you don't exercise, you just don't have answers. Also, so it's interesting that you echo that.
I agree with that completely, and I think the heuristics can be again, the heuristics that you build up. These are rules of thumb that allow you to cut through applying some intuition and some data. But I think that the interesting thing is that sometimes those heuristics fail, right? And we all have them. It's sort of when you see something you don't expect and the rule of thumb doesn't apply, it puts you into a spiral. And it's something to be careful to avoid, not to rely too much on those heuristics.
Yeah.
They tend to serve you in stability, not in times of crisis.
In fact,
unless the crisis that you've seen is the same one you saw last time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. In fact, this is a great segue to the skill question around what can people do in order to do this. So, in my own small reflection, I found that over a period of time, one needs to build a deeper sense of self-awareness and meta-cognition, meta-emotion, to be able to preside over the various things that are coming from inside of a person in terms of the filters that one has, the biases one has, and the ability to preside over it rather than getting overwhelmed by it and hence taking decisions. So I think one of the important things so if self-awareness and metacognition and emotional intelligence, would you weigh in on, do you consider these skills as extremely important in today's time, and do you recommend these to your clients, or how do you help people develop these kind of skills?
Well, first, let me just say I'm not an expert in emotional intelligence. Okay, so where we see a significant deficit in an individual along the lines that you just described, we will generally bring in third-party experts to help bring advice to our clients on those dimensions. But to your point, because we do that, we do recognize obviously that it is important, and that self-awareness and the ability to, have empathy with others in times of difficulty or even times of smooth sailing is always important. But I think the interesting thing is, if you kind of think about, you're never on an island, right? So no leader, no part of a team is ever alone. So there's always the human dynamic where others have to be engaged or brought along the journey to get things done. So that never goes away, and those variables are always important to that. But I think the interesting thing is sometimes even you know the right thing, but these things become constraints because everyone else is panicking and they're not going to come along. And being able to navigate and provide comfort and confidence during a time of just catastrophic uncertainty is a very, very important skill. But to your point, that skill almost never gets exercised, at least to the degree that it's being exercised now. So very few ways exist to test that at scale other than to simulate that. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because you can't sit in a classroom that doesn't at least simulate that pressure and listen to people talk about theories about emotional intelligence and self-awareness and things like that. Those things will be on a shelf in your memory. And as we all know, the ability to pull them off the shelf and apply them is very difficult if you're not already in tune with that. I mean, some people are naturally high EQ and other things and have, as a result, are able to draw on those things without having to deliberately build the skills. But look, it's important, but I think you have to find ways to develop those skills not only, again, two axes, not only for yourself, but you got to develop those skills with your team, with your customers, with your suppliers, with the people that you rely on in your business environment. And that requires investment in time and so forth. And the other axis is you've got to invest in doing it in such a way that it simulates the situation and not isn't a theoretical construct, which the theory has to be, you have to be able to apply the theory. So I'm a pilot, right? So when I fly an airplane, I'll give you an example. When I was a student pilot, in my 10th hour, maybe it was my 12th hour, second unsupervised solo, I had an engine failure on takeoff, which is the worst possible scenario you can have in an aircraft, right? So you have zero power. I was probably flying this thing at about 850 feet, and luckily I was in a big runway. But my instructor, to his credit, always, we did the theory, but every single landing we made, we did it dead stick, no power landing, every time. From the very first time I did my first landing, all the way to 12 hours later, which isn't a lot, okay? And that 100% saved my life, the way he trained me for that. And also, the other thing is, the way he trained me to use the radio, this is my other point about there are other people involved. There's a tower control there, and you've got to communicate with them what's going on, because they have N other aircraft and people on the ground that they've got to keep safe and so forth. And you've got to communicate with them, and you got to do these things at the same time. Fly the plane, communicate with these people. Obviously, fly the plane first. But unless I had that training in that context, we did the dead stick landing every time with constant radio contact and so forth, I would not be here having this conversation today. And I think that kind of simulated kind of experience is essential. And if we can't get it, then we have to go find ways to kind of put that together. You just can't. Yeah. And of course, a lot of it happens, you either sink or swim, right? So this is a sink or swim situation. People are out there getting experience right now because this is what's happening. There's no better crucible for learning than a real-time situation. But many won't come through this.
Experiential journey rather than just hearsay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
A couple of things that came up when you were talking earlier. By some account, they say we are in an exponential world right now. In the sense, things are so interconnected and interdependence. So interconnectedness and interdependency is the highest in our history of humanity. What that does is it just throws up crises every now and then. A. B. There is a sudden barrage of negative news coming from all over the world now. Do you see do you get concerned of something called as crisis fatigue? That there are so many crises happening at so many levels, and even in people's own journey, there are so many crises now cropping up. Do you see that as a concern?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think that I personally don't see crisis fatigue as an issue, at least that I've experienced with all the stakeholders that I work with. But I think the change fatigue is real, just in terms of, we're not, again, as I mentioned before, because things have been stable for so long and all of a sudden we're not programmed to be able to adapt that quickly. So we're having to reprogram in real time. So there's no doubt about that. But is it fatigue? Yes, for some people it's fatigue, and for other people it's almost like a high. You know what I mean?
They're exercising.
Well, they're exercising, but they get the adrenaline rush from it, and therefore, they find that to be very very exciting. And I think the fascinating thing about that question is that I would argue that we need to, back to my point about hyper-mobilization, we need to architect our businesses to be able to operate like this 24/7. Okay, which requires vastly different ways of thinking about things. For example, the traditional vertical hierarchy in firms where We have the boss, and it flows down multiple levels into a very rigid functional kind of organization. And that is disappearing, where over time we'll see a much more horizontal construct kind of develop, where everything is pointed like an arrow to solve a particular problem or address a particular challenge. And the goal will be to assemble and disassemble resources as quickly as possible to deal with the problem or to capitalize on the opportunity. And that creates a very different dynamic. I think that's the muscle that we have to build, is how do we assemble these resources in a way that can capitalize on the opportunity, solve the problem, do that at scale and do it very rapidly, and then blow the whole thing up and reconfigure it to the next opportunity or next problem. Right now, we're in a kind of transition state between those two things, where people who have traditionally been in vertical hierarchies are taxed on their discretionary time to be the other thing at the same time. And that's very difficult. And that's where the change fatigue comes in, or the crisis fatigue. I just have no more bandwidth to deal with these things. And that's where I think people, they fall into that. But that's our fault as leaders for not constructing the organizations or the systems to be able to handle that. And why don't we? Well, we've inherited the current system from our grandparents, largely, who came out of the two wars, who built organizational structures in a highly command and control military style, which is was the perfect setup for the 20th century, but not at all relevant, or at least in the transition. We're seeing a lot of teething problems with the way, to your point about exponential systems as opposed to linear systems, that our organizational science hasn't caught up to that.
Interesting. In fact, that's again a good segue. The last that I checked, there is no CEO of the world, in the sense there's no single person driving the world. But
thank goodness.
Instead, we have different actors or agents in the world, and they work more like systems. And there is an emergent phenomena of how things veer in certain direction. Now, one of the features of these emergent system is exactly the point that you mentioned, the rapidity of it, the in the shortest possible time, speed, speed scaling, blitz scaling, hyper-mobilization. So one school of thought definitely believes that we need to create structures and skills to be able to live up to these demands of the need for hyper-mobilization. There's another school which believes that we need to slow down. We need to slow down the pace of the world for various reasons. One, for self-discovery, for letting people develop their own hobbies, and even the demands it's putting on the planet Earth because of the scale. And there are these two schools that are currently fighting, or maybe there are some who are adopting features of the other in some sense in their school. How do you weigh in on something like this?
Look, first of all, I think that the world is driving the need to be in the first category, which is fast and mobilized. We can slow down, but the rest of the system isn't going to. You know what I mean? So to your point about being interconnected and there being no boss of the world, in the absence of that, it would take quite a movement, I think, to be able to slow things down. But on some things, for example, climate change, we don't want to slow down. We want to deploy we need people to have a discovery that this is a key issue that needs to be solved in a way that's both hyper-mobilized and extremely interconnected. And, we can't slow down on these kinds of things. Pandemic, as coming out of this, my fear is that we slot back into a post-SARS world where, we do long after-action reviews and so forth, and then we fall into another state of complacency, which is very typical of post-crisis. And then we're again not prepared 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, whatever it is when this happens again. And it will, right? So it's inevitable. So I don't know. For my own part, I find that, first, coming back to my post-ego and pre-ego point, right, is that one thing gets in the way more than anything else. We have what I would describe as an increasingly zero-sum leadership, which is both corporate and political, which makes us incapable, and that zero-sum leadership is built around national ego, individual ego, and so forth, which is not post-ego at all. It is not it's not a situation where the system rules and the parts fall into the system. It's a system where the parts try to rule at the expense of the system, and that's got to change. I, for one, don't think we can slow down at all on those variables. But I think in our own self-discovery, we can find ways to slow down. And again, these are choices. We can turn off the news. We can turn off the internet. We can go to the beach. I, for one, I like to go to my farm and cut brush and wood, and fish on the lake and whatever. And it's very relaxing there, and I don't have a lot of distraction. We have to be mindful of, no human being can operate at that sort of pace 24 hours a day for a long period of time. But I would make the argument that you can do it in your work life, which is your 8 hours a day or your 10 or your 12 hours a day, and then balance that by not doing it in the rest of your life. So I think individuals need balance, but the system is depending on us to work collaboratively at a very high rate. And if we can't discover how to do that, we're going to be more and more vulnerable to these types of crises. And in a local sense, companies are going to be vulnerable, to disruption. And as we've seen over the last decade, that's accelerating too. So,
yeah. Related to the question that I asked, the other question, and this would be perhaps the last one, and I'll request you to add your comments after that. The question is that on one side we have this interconnectedness, interdependency, and then this whole efficiency driven corporate performance, where we see that over a period of time within most of the industries you have fewer and fewer players, and suddenly when you are confronted with something which is a global crisis, there are supply side shocks. And for quite some time, under the Sustainable Development Goals of United Nations, there has been this voice for localizing production and localizing consumption. So, there are a few things that are happening in the world, in the entire market space, as I see. On one side, there are the incumbents, the large incumbents who are trying to still globalize. There are the insurgents or the challengers who are trying to topple with newer business model. But both of them mostly are trying to cater to larger span, larger geography kind of models. And then on the other side, there are the smaller geography, community kind of models that are also evolving. Any thoughts around how do you weigh in on this?
Well, it's interesting. I think that the dynamic that you just described about at least some incumbents getting more powerful and some insurgents having a very material impact on structures of industries, they're almost like two wrecking balls smashing everyone up in the middle, right? So there's definitely that factor. The localization point is an interesting one, and I think that there are certain things that are vastly more efficient to do at scale. For example, right now with the COVID-19 crisis, finding a vaccine in time to resolve the world crisis is something that has to be done at scale and leverage, the billions of dollars that only come from scale players and governments to be able to make that happen. Now, it's possible some guy in a lab somewhere will synthesize the first vaccine to that, and that may be the case, but that vaccine still has to get to the rest of the world.
Production and logistics, yeah.
Exactly. So I think that balance is interesting. I'd say that there's probably, the act, so think global, act local is something that's kind of people have talked about for decades, but we're seeing a balance of that happening. For example, energy distribution. There's a global shift to localized production of that, but that brings very big questions about the marginal economics of distribution systems, because even if all of us are on local production, you still have to have a factory to get power to the hospital, right? And of course, the marginal cost of that goes up to almost infinity. Healthcare, similarly the same problem. So trying to find that balance is really difficult. Education, that's one that I think will start going more local. Local manufacturing, these disruptions of supply chains, I think are going to get people who will step back and say, we need to change the mix, right? Our supply chain is too fragile. Everything's just in time, and most of it comes from China or India or Vietnam, or at least in the Western world. I suppose it flows the other way for certain goods and services as well. We're going to find that those long supply chains either have to be inefficiently stockpiled, which creates huge inventory risk, or on the other hand, we have to deconstruct some of this. I think that's going to inevitably happen. But as I said before, the challenge that we're going to see is that our memories as a species are extremely short. So all we need is 5 years of stability to wash that back to, the pendulum sort of going back to where it was before. So I intellectually agree and believe that a more local flavor to things in certain industries is certainly important. But it's also more possible now than it's ever been, because it doesn't matter where you are on the planet. You're sitting there in India, I'm sitting here in Australia. We're having a perfect, literally a perfect conversation without any distraction, and we could be in the same room together. And that's more and more the way people are operating, especially for the digital natives that sit behind our generation, who are programmed to behave this way, where they can have 1 foot local and 1 foot global without even thinking about it. The rest of us have to reprogram to operate that way.
Interesting, Matt. Any closing comments you want to make?
I guess from my point of view, I think that, first of all, I think it's wonderful what you're doing. I had the opportunity to review some of the videos of other people that are bringing valuable insights. I just hope that I made some small contribution to
absolutely a lot.
Your goals. And I think my message to anybody, as an individual, as a company, as a government, is to take this opportunity to keep doing, but doing differently. And we've got to step back and rethink all of the assumptions that underpin how we operate and how that affects the models of government, the models of business, and to your point, even the models of our own mental health, which I think if we're not able to do that collectively, we at least have to do it individually.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt, for your time, your insights, your warmth, as always.